Sharon Sandomirsky was born in Saskatchewan, Canada, and studied at York University in Toronto before she moved to North Carolina in the 1960s and studied computer science at UNC in Chapel Hill. She met John Wilson while working in computer science at Duke, and they collaborated on this article. But she is more well known for her career as a bluegrass musician, starting with the Fuzzy Mountain String Band. She moved to Austin in 1991 and has been recording bluegrass music and working at radio station KOOP for many years. Not your typical sociology author for sure. John Wilson received his PhD in sociology from Oxford in England in 1966. He taught for 2 years at the University of East Anglia before joining the sociology department at Duke, where he remained for the rest of his career as a scholar of social movements, religion, and the phenomenon of volunteering. This article investigates the downturn in religious participation that has been long observed among young adults as they move out of their parents' homes, sometimes also moving out of their parents' religion at the same time. Such disaffiliation in early adulthood sets the stage for possible returns to church, such as those documented earlier by Nash and Berger. This 1990 article starts from a very American perspective on religion, that when you make or break a connection with an organized religion, this amounts to a special case of what sociologists call voluntary affiliation. The study of such voluntary joining behavior, in fact, has been the central focus of John Wilson's research all of his life. His interest in religion comes from that starting point. It is not without significance, they say, that Americans speak comfortably about their religious preferences. If you prefer one religion over another, you can quit one and join the other. We know, though, that whether you can put on and take off religious identity like a pair of shoes actually varies a lot by time and place. In fact, no sooner have Sandomirsky and Wilson situated their article within this general topic of voluntary affiliation than they compensate by admitting that at least the belonging side of this coin may have a less voluntary, institutionalized aspect. The process of childhood religious socialization, as we also know, is not just a voluntary choice made by children. But here we're not looking at childhood. Sandomirsky and Wilson have information about young adults, first interviewed when they were in high school, and then followed up a dozen years later. These people got connected to an organized religion earlier in their lives, but now we want to know what makes people leave such groups. While getting into a religion may to some extent be ascribed, that is, assigned to you without any choice or action on your part, quitting a religion makes more sense as an achieved or voluntary action that you choose for yourself. Leaving your religion is called disaffiliation, the opposite of joining or affiliation. We have observed for a very long time that such turning away from a church does not just happen randomly during people's lives. It tends to happen a lot, for instance, during late adolescence and early adulthood, precisely the stage of life covered by the people studied here. In that sense, even though this article was published more than 20 years after the article by Nash and Berger, we can think of Sandomirsky and Wilson's study as a sort of prequel to that research on getting married and taking your children back to church with you. All of the people joining churches in the study by Nash and Berger had not previously been members of any church. They were coming back from somewhere outside organized religion. Now in this article, we find out where that somewhere was. How did a bunch of young adults get outside of organized religion so that they could become joiners again later? In most cases, they must have left or disaffiliated themselves from some childhood religion. What made them do it? Which young adults are most likely to leave a church, a religion in which they've been brought up by their parents? From Sandomirsky and Wilson's Table 2, we know that different denominations in the United States experience different levels of disaffiliation. In the young adult sample that they studied, less than 1/4 of those brought up as Mormons or Jews left those groups in the years studied. In contrast, between 2/3 and 3/4 of all the young adults brought up in mainline Protestant denominations, like Presbyterians, Methodists, or especially the old Saltwater Pilgrim Church of the Congregationalists, drifted out of those denominations during the third decade of their lives. Table 2 also shows us another important distinction made by Sandomirsky and Wilson, that between just plain quitting religion altogether, sometimes called apostasy, and simply switching from one religion to another, or conversion. Logically, they say, first you need to decide who has quit and who has stayed religious. Then, among those who have stayed religious, you can make a distinction between those who actually stayed in the same religious group and those who are still religious but who switched to a different group. They look at these two different exits from a particular denomination in two separate analytical steps. There are also two ways to explain observed contrasts in rates of disaffiliation. First, people might leave denominations based on different beliefs or practices. For example, we know that the Mormon practice of sending young adults out on missions creates a powerful reinforcing effect on their religious identities. This could help to explain why they lose fewer young people than any other group. But second, the people in different denominations might also be different in other ways, and it could be those other differences that explain rates of disaffiliation. For example, Sandomirsky and Wilson single out Lutherans and Jews as two groups that have cohesive ethnic identities, usually coming from specific countries of origin. To stop belonging to such groups, you have to reject not only your religion, but your ethnicity. This is harder to do, so fewer people do it. According to Sandomirsky and Wilson, the most important other way that people can be different comes from details of their family life. This is because, they tell us, the two least differentiated institutions in our society are religion and the family. Institutional differentiation is another huge topic in sociology. Differentiation increases with the size and complexity of a society. In a traditional small-scale culture, you have just one consistent identity, like a room with one window. Through that same window, you experience all of your connections to other people, what we might call your roles in family, religion, career, and so on. But in contemporary American society, you have a lot of windows. When you look out one window, you see your family. But you have to move over and look out a different window to see your job. Through other windows, you can see your religious self, your political self, and so on. What you see out one window may have little or nothing to do with what you see out of a different one. When you're at work, you're not at home. When you're at home, you're not in church. The institutionalized dimensions of your life have become separated, differentiated from each other. But Sandomirsky and Wilson tell us that even in our complex, differentiated society, family and religious roles for people remain less separated than other institutionalized facets of our lives. So they look at family differences as their first choice for explaining why some people leave religion while others don't. They actually split this important category into two installments of family life that we all go through. The first is the family you experience as a child, your parents, your siblings, sometimes called your family of orientation. Did your parents take you to church? Did your mother and father share the same religious background, or did they come from different religions themselves? Different answers to these questions might affect whether you stay in the church of your childhood when you grow up, or take some other path. The second installment of family life comes when you cross over and become the parent rather than the child, sometimes called the family of procreation for that reason. But do you actually get married yourself, or maybe stay single? If you do get married, do you have children of your own or not? After all, Nash and Berger already explained that parents are likely to go to church with their children. And are you and your spouse from the same religious backgrounds? Again, all of these things could affect whether you quit going to church, or if you do stay in church, whether you switch from one denomination to another. This is the heart of the explanatory framework that Sandomirsky and Wilson hope will help them to predict which young adults quit going to church or switched from one religious group to another. We'll see what they discovered on this score. Since Sandomirsky and Wilson break down their analysis into two installments, we will consider each stage of disaffiliation separately and in the order that they study them. First comes their model of people deciding whether to stay involved in church or to drop out of religion altogether. Such a decision to reject organized religion and simply draw the blinds on that window of institutionalized roles and relationships, also goes by the term apostasy, meaning without faith. Of course, these people may still carry on some kind of internal faith life, but the significant fact about their lives for us is that they cut their ties to this social institution of organized religion, which is what sociology is all about. Sandomirsky and Wilson want to explain such choices in terms of other, earlier facts about these young adults. The irony of this search for antecedent explanations is that if we truly could explain most such disaffiliation in terms of preceding life experiences, this would seem to shift those decisions from the realm of achieved free will actions that mean so much to John Wilson back towards socially determined, ascribed outcomes. So let's see what they actually find out about such predictions. The first kind of family factors come from respondents' childhoods, from their family of origin. We know whether the parents of these young adults both shared the same religion, known as religious homogamy, or came from different religious backgrounds. Growing up with parents who attempt to bridge the social boundaries between religions with an interfaith marriage could make you more likely to drop out of religion yourself later on. The second childhood predictor is how often the respondents attended church in those early years. If going to church as you're growing up has a sort of dose-response relation to your tendency to keep going after you grow up, this also should predict disaffiliation decisions. This actually may give us a better handle on that parental situation, since your church attendance probably was determined in large part by those parents. We get a clue about how the homogamy or interfaith marriage played out in everyday life in terms of actual social interactions in the formal, institutionalized setting of the church. At this point, we probably should note that Sandomirsky and Wilson leave out non-family explanations that show up in many other studies of religiosity in early adulthood. Lots of scholars have suggested that if you start to explore new behaviors like sex, drugs, and rock and roll that your religion frowns upon, you might feel that you have to choose one life over the other. You might reject religion as limiting your new adult freedoms to be wild and crazy. Sandomirsky and Wilson are not much concerned about this. They argue that such personal lifestyle choices come from those same childhood contexts that we already have in the model. Religious disaffiliation is heads, and sex, drugs, and rock and roll are tails on the coin of young adulthood. So if you predict one of them, in this case disaffiliation, based on earlier life experiences, you've predicted them both. So they're happy with their model without including such considerations. After looking at childhood, they also ask whether these young adults got married themselves or are still leading the single life. If you remain single, they expect a greater chance that you'll quit going to church. If you get married, they want to know whether you marry someone from the same religious background. If you do, you should be more likely to keep going to church because there's no awkward decision about whose religion to keep or about how to walk down both sides of the street at the same time. And finally, of course, they want to know whether you've had children of your own, because we already know from Nash and Berger and lots of other research that this is one of the strongest predictors that you'll be in church yourself on a regular basis. So what do they find? In Table 3, they give us results of their statistical model, but these numbers are a bit obscure. They express the logarithm of the odds of disaffiliation for different groups of respondents. For example, if half the people leave church and half stay, the odds are 50% over 50%, or 1, and the logarithm of 1 is 0. So a score of 0 would be even odds of disaffiliation versus staying in church. The actual intercept at the top of Table 3 is a positive number, 1.43 for men and 1.17 for women. So more than half of these respondents abandoned the religion of their childhood. In fact, these values translate to odds of 4.2 men quitting for every one who stayed, that is 81% of men, and 3.2 women quitting for every one who stayed, that is 76% of women. These are amazingly high disaffiliation levels, but we'll come back to that later. Here you see a figure that translates all these logarithms into actual odds of quitting religion for the different considered groups, always as an adjustment to those overall high odds of quitting, indicated by the two intercepts at the top of the table. If this adjustment is less than 1, it means lower odds of quitting compared to the reference group estimated by the intercept value. For example, the odds of quitting are only 0.84 for men and 0.80 for women if their parents were from the same religion, compared to parents who didn't have a common religious background. The prediction works. Religious homogamy of parents predicts you're less likely to quit church later yourself. In fact, all of their considered measures work out pretty well. How often you went to church with your parents is an even stronger predictor than their religious homogamy. And when it comes to your own family status as an adult, the results are even stronger. Men who have become fathers are only 1/6 as likely to quit church as men who have no children yet, the sharpest contrast in Table 3, just as Nash and Berger would have predicted. But Sandomirsky and Wilson note an interesting pattern here. The two predictors that refer back to childhood experiences predict quitting more strongly for women than for men, suggesting that women are more influenced by their parents than are men. On the other hand, your adult family situation affects quitting for men much more than for women. All the blue bars are longer than the equivalent red bars here. Sandomirsky and Wilson are a little uncomfortable about these adult family measures, though. They admit that they have here yet another of those annoying chicken and egg problems we run into so often. Does being a married parent keep you in church? That is, does the family cause your religious activity? Or does staying in church and remaining religious in young adulthood steer you in the direction of getting married and having children? Which is the cart and which is the horse? Family connections or religious connections? We can't settle that here. We'll just have to be satisfied to know that these two social institutions indeed still seem to be strongly connected, even when other institutional facets of life may have gotten more differentiated. These greater childhood influences for women and adult influences for men balance each other, leaving only a small overall difference in quitting for women versus men. And the other important conclusion we can draw from Table 3 is that once we consider all these family factors, the differences between religious denominations mostly fade away to insignificance. The only distinction that still matters is whether you're Mormon or not. Even after considering all family factors, Mormons are still significantly less likely to leave organized religion during their young adult years. Again, we may be looking at evidence of the impact of going on those missions. After examining the respondents who dropped out of religions, Sandomirsky and Wilson turned to the remainder of their respondents who still belonged to a church, not only in high school, but also when re-interviewed a dozen years later. We can think of these remaining people as persistently committed to having a religious identity through the first 3 decades of their lives. But we need to remember that right from the start, this rules out over half the people in their sample because a majority of all respondents no longer belong to any organized religious group by the follow-up date. A disproportionate share of their religious survivors had parents of the same faith, went to church in high school, and since then have gotten married and had children. Sandomirsky and Wilson used the same set of predictors to try to understand decisions to switch between churches that they applied in the first round to decisions about quitting religion. We can't expect these variables to do as well in predicting switching decisions as they did for quitting because we've cut down the range of variability in the sample considerably. Here again, you see a chart that translates all the obscure logarithms from Table 4 in the article into relative odds, this time odds of changing from one religion to another, again compared to people without the status we look at in each case. People with parents sharing the same religion are less likely to switch their own religion by age 30 than are people with parents in interfaith marriages, as are those who went to church more often in high school. Neither of these family of origin effects are statistically significant, but they are in the expected direction, and they're about the same for men and for women. If the sample had been larger, these effects probably would have been significant. When we look down the next 3 bars in the figure, though, we find contrasts with the results for quitting religion. Married men are much less likely than single men to switch between religions, but this pattern is much weaker for women. Sandomirsky and Wilson interpret this as telling us that the effects of their family of origin remain stronger longer for women, but for men, their decisions about forming new families of their own have major effects on their religious involvement. This same gender contrast also appears for people who become parents, compared to those still without children by 1979. Again, this makes a big difference for men and a very much smaller difference for women. But the most fascinating result occurs when we consider people who have formed interfaith versus homogamous marriages, assuming that they've gotten married by this point in their lives. We must be extremely careful in thinking about this result. The key issue to keep in mind here is that when we say the respondent and spouse belong to the same religion, we're talking about their religion at the time of the follow-up survey in 1979. Religious homogamy does not mean that both partners had the same religion back in high school. This could have been true, or one or the other could have switched to produce the homogamy by 1979. When they both had the same religion back in high school, numbers of men and women, of course, would match, so any difference here is due to the switching possibility for the man or the woman. In spouse-same couples, we find that women actually have odds of switching more than half again higher than for women in interfaith marriages. This sounds like these women have switched to match their husband's religion. At the same time, in these spouse-same couples, the men are extremely unlikely to have switched religions, only 1/10 as likely as men in interfaith marriages. Since men in interfaith marriages obviously had no motive to switch to match their wives, they don't match after all, the men married to women in the same religion very probably have convinced their wives to switch if those wives came into the marriage with some other faith left over from high school. These results also are not statistically significant due to the small sample size and to the fact that we've already tossed out some of the variation in our predictors by eliminating the people who quit religion altogether. But this gender contrast raises the most tantalizing, unanswered questions from Sandomirsky and Wilson's article. Usually in other research, women seem to have more influence than men on the religious identity of their children, for example. Is this a case where they do not have such influence on their own religious identity? Maybe you'll do a study about this one day. Sandomirsky and Wilson also find very important, statistically significant switching effects for starting out in certain denominations, unlike leaving religion altogether, where only the Mormons were different from the rest. This time we're looking back to denominations in high school, not at the time of the survey. It turns out that people who did not quit religion in general, and who were Mormons, Catholics, or Lutherans in high school, are significantly less likely to switch to some other religion by the time they get to about age 30. This is true even after we take into account any differences across denominations in the other family factors. In all three cases, women from these denominations are more resistant to switching than are men, again reflecting the consistent pattern that influences from that earlier period in life seem to be stronger for women than for men. Why should these groups hold on to their youthful members more effectively? The authors suggest that these groups share more overlap between religious and family roles for people, that religion may be an element of the more complicated concept of ethnicity. It was true in those decades that both Catholics and Lutherans tended to have fairly distinctive ethnic backgrounds in terms of countries where they or their ancestors originated, more true then than it is today. Sandomirsky and Wilson argue that in those groups it is harder to give up your religion because it would be like giving up your whole ethnic identity. But this is a strange explanation for Mormons. As a homegrown American religion, they do not trace roots back to some special stream of ethnic immigrants. It seems more reasonable that Mormons may be doing something special to retain their young members, such as the missions on which they're sent. At any rate, clearly the authors have established one of their central arguments, that we should not lump together quitting religion and switching between religions as the same kind of decision. Research since this article appeared usually has been careful to keep this distinction in mind. Sandomirsky and Wilson have one other important point for us to remember. Their respondents were in high school in the late 1960s and then re-interviewed 12 years later in 1979. These respondents were born right in the middle of the baby boom generation, shown as the third line from the bottom in this chart, showing percents not affiliated with any religion for different generations. The earlier generations, born in the first half of the 20th century, shown as the bottom two lines, were much more religious. This measure of religiosity remains pretty much constant within any generation as it ages over the decades. But starting with the boomers, each new generation has been much less religious than the last. This means that boomers have disaffiliated from religion compared to their parents, who are cruising along those two lower lines. And if we look at Generation X, born even more recently, and then the most recent millennials, this generational disaffiliation has continued at a steady pace. So Sandomirsky and Wilson were in the right place at the right time to capture the beginning of a powerful trend away from belonging to churches that has continued right down to the present. Parents have lost the ability they once had to keep their children in their own denominations, or even in any religion at all. Is this a weakening of religion or a weakening of the family? This is a controversial question that you probably will be asking about your own children one day. The other limitation noted by the authors is that they were studying an unusual sample of young adults limited to the state of Washington in the Pacific Northwest. They point out that for a long time, and still today, this is one of the least religious, most progressive regions in the country, so that we can't take their results as representative for the country as a whole. However, since 1990, when they published this article, the rest of the country has been catching up to these religious patterns uncovered there decades ago, and in that sense, this article still speaks to us today.